Hi, everyone. So my name is Dr. Amanda Sharples. I am an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. I have somewhat recently started doing research in the area of parental alienation. I would say it was around 2020 that I actually reached out to Dr. Harmon to connect and learn a bit more about the work. Because as we like to say in psychology, research is me-search, and often we study the things that most impact and affect our lives. And for me, up until 2018, as I was defending my dissertation, I didn't know what parental alienation was. I had never heard of it. And I had someone close to me that was dealing with a very challenging separation that had been going on for a while. And there were these very odd, very counterintuitive behaviors that were presenting in the children, and I had no idea what it was until I started to do research myself. And I was very thankful to find the work that was published by Dr. Harmon, Dr. Warshak, Dr. Abby Baker as well, just learning more about what these signs and symptoms are and actually being able to put a name to this pattern of behavior and see that there is empirical research and, in fact, really great empirical research that's being done right now on the topic. And so, after a few years of having this impact my life, though thankfully it wasn't directly, I'm very thankful that I'm able to co-parent my oldest son with his father without this conflict. But I think it's in part because I am able to do that I also look at these situations and it's challenging to understand it. But that's why I wanted to get involved in this research. And I think it's just kind of important to share our experiences to some extent when we're talking about where we're coming from in doing this work, so that you understand why I'm doing it and how I may view it. That said, I try to be very objective, and I've always tried to be very objective going into it. I see myself first and foremost as a scientist, and I want to know the truth about how things play out in the world. And that's really what I wanted to understand here with this work, looking at these findings of abuse in families that are affected by parental alienation. I was very inspired by the theoretical paper published by Dr. Harmon, Dr. Denise Hines, and Eric Kruk that were looking at, or rather, making these connections between what we know about domestic violence and child abuse to the behaviors we see in the context of parental alienation. And it's very challenging, as I'm sure most of you understand, to objectively study this. There's obviously ethical issues that come into play. There's some great qualitative work that's been done, looking at the experiences of alienated parents and the kinds of abuse they had to deal with in their relationship and even post-separation, and what they saw their children being exposed to. But of course, there's limitations to any method that we use with qualitative work. There's always the argument that, of course, there's bias that comes into that. We don't necessarily know to what extent we're getting the full picture of that situation. And so we were hoping that by looking at this data where we were able to actually analyze these case studies, so the Appellate data that was collected in the United States, as well as the court records that we have from the Canadian trial data, we could get perhaps a more objective picture of what's actually happening in the court system and how these situations or these cases where alienation is founded, that's what we're really focusing on here, may be related to other forms of abuse, so intimate partner violence as well as child abuse. I do want to actually just acknowledge the fact that this is a secondary analysis of data that was collected, again, originally by Dr. Harmon and Lorendos for their 2021 study, and as well as the replication of that with the Canadian data in 2023 with Dr. Harmon, Giancarlo Lorendos, and Brian Ludmer. Okay, so just to provide some context in discussing our beliefs about the relationship, or rather the different theories about the relationship between parental alienation and abuse. We do understand that the use of children as a weapon is central to our definitions of intimate partner violence. And we're going to look at this when we look at the wheel of power and control, which has been reconceptualized in the context of parental alienation as well. But it is a central feature of that process. Previous scholars have described the parallels between parental alienation and, the parallels between parental alienating behaviors and coercively controlling abuse. So we do understand that when people are in this context where they separate, one of the only ways, really, that somebody has the ability to continue to exert power over the other party is through that process of controlling the children. And this also gives them the ability to control things like, of course, that relationship with the children, but things from a financial perspective, the mental health and well-being of the other parent. So it's really one of the tools that they have left, for lack of a better way of saying it. And research has found that parents that use these parental alienating behaviors tend to also have similar characteristics to parents that engage in other abusive behaviors. So we tend to find that they are exhibiting these traits that are consistent with what we call cluster B personality disorders. And these are the personality disorders where you really see these toxic interpersonal behaviors coming out. These are things like a lack of empathy, an inability to regulate one's own emotions, very black and white thinking. Everything's all or none. If you are good to me, I'm good to you, but if you do the slightest thing to harm me or to make me feel bad, I'm going to see you in an entirely negative way. So that kind of splitting, actually, that we see in severely alienated children as well. So it makes sense that this would be part of this pattern of coercively controlling domestic violence or interpersonal violence. So again, when we look at this wheel of coercive control, and this is an image that was actually created by Amanda Sharples, who is a formerly alienated child who's spoken up quite a bit about this topic. We see here again when we look at the wheel, so using children. So using the child as a weapon against the targeted parent is encouraging the child to defy the targeted parent. So encouraging them to not respect their rules, to see them as lacking authority, and to kind of demonstrate that same disrespect towards them that they may be watching their alienating parent demonstrate in their interactions. Minimizing responsibility for behaviors, blaming the other parent for problems, and minimizing authority of the court. Right, so this could be, again, making up kind of stories about the other parent, things that they might be doing that are making your life difficult, and that in turn the child will internalize and then blame that targeted parent, and this will give them justification for rejecting that targeted parent. It could be saying things like, well, we don't, just because the judge said you have to go to reunification therapy, we don't have to go. You don't have to go if you don't want to go, right? So minimizing that authority of the court. Again, using economic abuse, so this is control and harm of the child and the targeted parent through economic means. This can be things like that operate through things like child support. It can be dragging that parent through court, knowing full well how expensive it is for them to pay for representation, to be there, perhaps even having to take time off work to be there. That's going to put them at an economic disadvantage, especially if that parent is in a situation where they have an economic advantage and can afford to do that, and they know that the other parent cannot afford to do that. You have the using of physical and sexual abuse behaviors. So these are things like physical abuse of the targeted parent, sexual abuse and exploitation of the targeted parent and or child. So again, I think this is very relevant to what we're talking about right now. We're talking about the connection between these forms of abuse, but one thing I found, and we'll talk about this as we look at the research, is when you look at these cases, there is some overlap. And in fact, when parents are trying to alienate, there are a lot of behaviors that they engage in that actually would be considered emotional abuse, obviously, but even physical abuse and sexual abuse, neglect even. For example, telling your child they have to get out of the car and walk 6 blocks home on their own because they told you they love their mom, right? These are things that happen, and so there is this connection across these different behaviors that can also make it challenging at times to disentangle parental alienation from these other forms of abuse, but I think also support our theory that they are part of a pattern. You have the use of threats and intimidation, kind of as I was already saying. These are things like stalking, harassing the targeted parent, legal and administrative aggression, so dragging them through court, forcing them to give up their time, money, energy to fight just to see their children. Antisocial behaviors, staging events, so this could be, for example, when you're at a parenting exchange with your child, setting it up such that the child's going to react in a negative way. This could be very emotionally distressing for the targeted parent and obviously the child. This is using coercion, so requiring the child to be loyal. We talked about loyalty-inducing behaviors. If you were able to watch Dr. Harmon's talk prior to this one, loyalty-inducing behaviors can be a big part of this. Of course, they can backfire, but are likely still a part of this process. And so making a child feel like they have to align with you, they have to agree with you, they have to do what you say, or else they may be subject to physical or emotional abuse or punishment for that, or for not doing that, I should say. Using isolation, so this is isolating the child and the targeted parent from social supports, and child abduction. Unfortunately, this is part of these cases, especially the more severe cases, children actually being abducted, taken to other provinces and countries so that they actually can't physically see the targeted parent anymore. Of course, there's the using of privilege, so using the privilege of gender and custodial status to gain custody advantage. So we can use different gender stereotypes to harm the other parent in court. For example, saying the father is neglectful or addicted to a substance or isn't financially stable or supporting the child, or saying the mother is mentally unstable. We pick up on these different stereotypes and use them to, I shouldn't say we, but alienating parents, to get that advantage in the court process. And then there's the using of emotional abuse. Again, one of the things I argue in the work that I've done in the paper I initially published is that parental alienation is a form of emotional abuse, but again, there's a lot of overlap, and it's difficult, again, to disentangle it from other forms of emotional abuse. It is all about brainwashing the child, making them think that the targeted parent is unhealthy, doesn't love them, or they should be afraid of them. It's making them believe that if they don't align with that alienating parent, they will be in danger or they will not get love from that parent. And so that splitting process happens as a way of protecting the self, of dealing with this really challenging high conflict situation, or I should say a situation of alienation where one parent is really using these behaviors while the other is not. Okay, so what did we want to do in our work? Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I had these. Those would have been helpful, but sorry. Okay. So some critics of parental alienation, as I'm sure most of you know, have argued that it's merely a legal defense that abusive parents use to maintain power and control and access with their children. However, we don't believe there's any credible, and doesn't seem to be the case that there's any credible research to support this claim. In fact, in this wonderful study, again, that was done by Dr. Harmon and Lorendos, they were replicating the work by Joan Meyer, where she was making that claim, which I believe was not peer-reviewed originally, but they replicated it, used the open science process, submitted it to a peer-reviewed journal, and I shouldn't even say they replicated the method, but the results suggested that this is not the case. It's not what's happening here. There aren't really any gender differences in who's alienating and how the courts are viewing it, and courts are not handing children over to abusive parents. They're very, very careful about how they evaluate these cases. Others have also argued that there's not enough evidence to support the claim that parental alienation may be a form of abuse. Simply stating that it's too vague, or emotional abuse, I believe to some extent it was kind of known emotional abuse is, this kind of emotional abuse is not really the same as other forms of abuse. Like, we shouldn't consider it in the same way. It's kind of normal for children to be exposed to this, which is really problematic to me. I think anytime you're exposing your child to a situation where they feel that they are emotionally or physically in danger or going to be neglected or have their needs neglected because they're not doing something that you as a parent expect them to do, that's a problem. None of us are perfect. I'm a parent, I'm not perfect, but I couldn't imagine consistently putting my child in that kind of situation, or really frequently at all doing that. So again, it is, I think, quite obviously a form of emotional abuse when children are consistently being exposed to this. The purpose of this current study, and indeed I'm going to talk about two studies. So the first one is one that was published, and I talked about this before, but I'm just going to kind of reiterate what I found for those of you that haven't read the paper or haven't seen that presentation. And then I'm going to talk a bit about some very preliminary analyses I've conducted with Canadian data. I say very preliminary because I've only started looking at this in the past couple weeks. I've been very busy with a lot of other data, but I want to be very clear that I do intend to go through this data more thoroughly. I really believe in looking at data very carefully before I publish things. But I think it aligns very well with what we've already found, and it makes sense given what we know. So again, the purpose was to empirically examine whether alienating parents use abusive behaviors that span multiple categories of abuse, because evidence of co-occurring victimization may provide support for the theory that these parental alienating behaviors are sometimes part of a pattern of behavior that's used by a coercively controlling parent to maintain power and control in the family. So for our first study, our hypothesis was that, one, when there's a finding of parental alienation, and these were pre-registered, I should say, so we developed our hypotheses before we actually collected it or looked at the data. So there was a higher likelihood of finding a substantiated claim of abuse against the alienating parent than the alienated parent, which is consistent with our theory that it's really the alienating parent that's using these abusive behaviors. Hypothesis 2 was that when there's a finding of parental alienation, there's a higher likelihood of finding an unsubstantiated claim of abuse against the alienated parents versus the alienating parent, which again is consistent with our hypothesis that this is a pattern of coercive control, and specifically, this is an example of legal and administrative aggression. This is a way in which the alienating parent is trying to gain an upper hand in the family court system by making false accusations of abuse to limit the alienated or targeted parent's time with their child. Okay, so with study 1, we had a sample of appellate cases. This was data collected in the United States, so that was the level of in the court system that we could get data from. Unfortunately, they're not as detailed as we'd like them to be, but there's a fair amount of information to kind of take away the information that we need to run these tests. So we looked at specifically cases in which parental alienation was known to have occurred. There was data looking at it being alleged, but we focused in the paper on cases where it was found by either a court official or an expert, like counselor that was involved in the process. Our sample for this study, again, only contained the original cases where PA was found to have occurred, again, by an independent evaluating expert or the court. We had 492 cases, which coincidentally is what we actually have for the second study too. It worked out the same. We had 245 cases where the father was the alienating parent and 247 where the mother was the alienating parent. So in this data set, we were trying to keep it consistent as possible across with respect to gender. The data file included 2 Excel spreadsheets. So the first one, it includes all of the information about the case, like all of the details for the case, the outcomes of the case, who the alienating parent was, whether alienation was found in that case, whether custody was changed. And then the second sheet was a separate one where there were separate rows provided for every single claim of abuse in each case. So it included many more rows because in some cases there were multiple cases of abuse. I think there was one case where there were upwards of like 20 claims of abuse, though I believe they were all false and it was both parents doing it in that case. But for the most part, there were a couple claims of abuse for each case. For our code book, what we did is we coded abuse claims by looking at the outcome in the family court case, as well as whether there was any outcome in a criminal court case, because again, obviously certain claims of abuse would go to criminal court as well. And we were really looking for any information about whether it was substantiated, there was any evidence found, any verdict made on the situation. Often, unfortunately, it was just unclear. And those were coded as a 3, like we called them unclear. Sometimes it was quite obviously unsubstantiated, like they would know there was no evidence to support this, or even they would say things like the children actually admitted they were lying, or the mother or father admitted they were lying about this claim. Those, I will say, were relatively rare relative to the rest, but they definitely did occur in the data set. So these two columns are critical. Again, they were the outcome of the investigation and the final court judgment. So looking at the descriptive statistics for study 1, we had 492 cases where PA was found to occur. In 41.46% of those cases, it didn't involve any claims of abuse, which is encouraging. And 25% it involved claims of abuse against the father, and 22.36% it involved claims made by both parties, and in 11.18% it involved claims just against the mother. I will say I still want to finalize the descriptives for study 2, but it was relatively similar. Okay, so looking at hypothesis 1, there was a significant main effect for abuse claims such that it was significantly more likely to be the case that when there was a substantiated claim of abuse, it was clearly found, and I want to note too that not only did I code this, but we had an independent research assistant coding the data that had no idea what the hypotheses were behind the research, and our data aligned very well. But when we looked at this data, when there was a substantiated claim of abuse against an alienating parent, or a substantiated claim, it was much more likely to be against the alienating parent as opposed to the alienated parent. And this is a medium-sized effect, we would say, 4.44. It's a very decent size of an effect for this kind of data. And it really just suggests that we're much more likely to see that when the courts are substantiating claims of abuse, it's the alienating parent that's likely to have that history of abusive behavior. And we can see when we look at the data here, right, when we look at alienating mothers, when they're accused of abuse, when we look at substantiated claims, in about 32% of the cases, they're substantiated. For alienating fathers, it's about 65% of the cases. And we can see that when they're accusing the other parent of abuse, that the percentage of claims that are substantiated go down quite a bit in relative to these substantiated claims towards the alienated parent. Now, when we look at our second hypothesis, which has to do with these, again, unsubstantiated claims, and so suggesting that this might be a tactic of legal and administrative aggression, we see that the results indicated that there was a main effect for abuse claims such that you were significantly more likely to find an unsubstantiated claim of abuse towards the alienated or targeted parent as opposed to the alienating parent. And again, when we look at the descriptives here, we can see that the percentage of the likelihood that you're going to see an unsubstantiated claim towards the party that's not alienating is much higher than what we see when we're looking at the likelihood of seeing a substantiated claim or an unsubstantiated claim, I should say, towards the targeted, towards the alienating parent, suggesting that this may be part of this pattern of legal and administrative aggression. So with study 2, what I wanted to do is I wanted to, again, replicate these findings in a new sample, so looking at Canadian trial data where we have more information, and extend them a bit because, again, we have more information. The Canadian trial data, we have these longer case records. It doesn't have to go to appeals court. We can actually look at the data from these court cases prior to getting to that level. And therefore, we get a more representative sample because obviously it can be challenging to get to the level of appeals court given the financial demands of that process. So we want to replicate these findings with the Canadian sample. So hypothesis 1 was, again, looking at whether we would be more likely to have a significant finding of substantiated abuse for an alienating parent compared to an alienated parent in cases where PA has been founded. We also, again, wanted to look at this legal and administrative abuse component to see whether the alienated parent would be more likely to have an unsubstantiated claim of abuse made against them compared to the alienating parent. And finally, I wanted to test this exploratory hypothesis, and I have other exploratory hypotheses I want to test. I'm curious to get opinions about this. I'm going to let you know a little bit about the data I have coded. But this one that we did look at, and I have to give credit to an undergraduate student who I worked with on this who helped me code the data. We wanted to look at whether specific categories of PABs, which we could now identify because we had more detailed information about what was happening in these cases, whether these would predict different categories of outcomes in children. So I'll talk a bit about how we coded this. These were not appellate cases. I apologize for that typo. Again, we were just looking at a sample of court cases in the Canadian court record. We had cases across Canada. Some were in French, so we had RAs that were translating that information, so we could code the data from Quebec as well as the data we had in the rest of Canada. We only, again, in this sample had cases where PA was founded. There were no cases where it was not founded. That was the focus. And we had independent experts looking at the data. And again, research assistants were coding, at least 2 different research assistants were coding all of the data. For the data file, there were actually 3 Excel spreadsheets. So the first one was the original Excel spreadsheet, which again had all of the information about the case, the judge involved, where it was located, the year in which it was initially it began, information about the outcomes of that case, whether who the alienating parent was, and things like that. In the second file, the second Excel spreadsheet, that's where we had more detailed information about what was happening. So we had qualitative data letting us know about the specific kinds of parental alienating behaviors the mothers and fathers were engaging in. And this is the data that I actually had research assistants go in and quantitatively code. So it was qualitative initially in that it was just written out. And then I trained my research assistants to identify certain categories of parental alienating behaviors. We went through a lot of the data together to do this. So we looked at things like spying behavior. Did they ask the child to get court information from the other parent or information about what the parent was doing in court? We looked at things like contact interference. Were they not letting the child see the parent? Were they interfering with contact time? We looked at things like denigration. Were they talking poorly about the other parent? We looked at behaviors like lying, so specifically whether there were false claims of abuse made by either the child or the other parent. So there are many different categories of behaviors we looked at. I can't get into all of it today, and eventually I might try to group some of them together depending on how much I see convergence when I look at the data across these different categories, but I thought it would be best to be as specific as possible when initially coding the data. Now the outcomes we looked at were broader outcomes. These were things like, because we had information about how the children were doing as well, that was again qualitative, and we coded these as things like behavioral outcomes. So these were things, as I note here, like whether, so with behavioral, it was things like substance abuse issues, gambling, not attending school, having issues with academics. They had mental health outcomes. These were things like depression, anxiety, being diagnosed with any kind of severe mental health issue. They had cognitive outcomes, so these were coded for things like language delays, intellectual impairments, psychomotor impairments. There were interpersonal issues, so these were things like deficits in their social interactions and the relationships they were developing with other people. And then there were physical issues as well, so did they have like cardiovascular issues, other health, like physical health issues? And then finally, we noticed in the coding process that there were some cases that really were both behavioral and interpersonal. And so these were things like exhibiting violent outbursts or aggressive behavior towards one's peers. And so we just coded that separately to be safe because it seemed to be like an overlap between the two. Okay, so with hypothesis 1, similar to what we found with study 1, we found that the alienated parent or the alienating parent was more likely to have a substantiated claim of abuse against them compared to the alienated parent. Again, supporting our theory that it's really that the alienating parent is abusive, engaging in this abusive behavior, and this alienating behavior, these parental alienating behaviors are part of this pattern of coercively controlling violence. With hypothesis 2, again, we replicated our findings. We found that the alienated parent was much more likely to have an unsubstantiated allegation. I want to be clear here, too, that these are completely these are the ones that were clearly coded as unsubstantiated. They're not the unclear ones, and they're not the substantiated ones. It's just the ones where there's no evidence to support them. So again, it just supports our hypothesis that alienated parents or targeted parents are more likely to have these potentially false claims. I want to be careful here because, again, just because it's unsubstantiated doesn't mean it was clearly false. It just means there really wasn't evidence to support it. But they're more likely to have those kinds of claims leveraged against them in court compared to the alienating parents. When it comes to the outcomes we saw with children, what we saw was that the overall quantity of parental alienating behaviors and the specific effects of each of these 8 categories of PABs that we were looking at did influence the outcomes in children in some interesting ways. I do want to explore this data a bit more, but I will say is for the most part, it was the total number of PABs, not necessarily a specific category, that was consistently positively predicting negative outcomes across most of, not all, but most of these categories. I'll break it down a bit more. There were some interesting cases in which we saw the opposite relationship, and I'll speculate a little bit on why. So with the mental health outcomes, we saw that, again, they were significantly predicted by the total number of PABs. With cognitive outcomes, denigration was actually the one that was most likely to predict it. Again, just maybe being exposed to all of this bad-mouthing, talking down to dismissing the authority of the other parent could really be negatively impacting the child from a cognitive perspective. It might even have to do with the fact that they are internalizing that to some extent because they identify with that parent still. Behavioral outcomes were predicted, again, really only by the total number of parental alienating behaviors. Nothing really predicted interpersonal outcomes. We didn't see that the total number or any specific category was in predicting those alone. Physical health outcomes were predicted by the total number of PABs again, though, this p-value is kind of like just at the cusp of significance. And the behavioral outcomes and interpersonal outcomes, when we look at them together, and it could just be that these are the kind of interpersonal outcomes that are more relevant to what might be affected by being exposed to these parental alienating behaviors, were predicted by, again, the total number of PABs and also this spying behavior specifically. So it could have something to do with being, again, kind of relating to that idea of enmeshment, really brought into this aligned relationship with the alienating parent, told that, you're allowed to do these things like steal from your other parent, spy on your other parent, monitor their behavior, things that from an interpersonal perspective are really not acceptable in most cases, are the sort of things that would have a negative impact on most of our interpersonal relationships, but they're being given permission and, in fact, encouraged to do that. And so it's potentially the case that that's why that spying behavior is having this negative impact on other behavioral interpersonal outcomes that we see. Again, this is all very preliminary and new data, though of course we have a lot of information, even some great longitudinal work looking at the negative outcomes of parental alienating behaviors on children, but I think it just allows us to better unpack how these specific categories of behaviors may relate to, again, these distinct categories of outcomes that we see in children. Now, I did also want to mention some more counterintuitive findings. Certain things were actually predicting less negative behaviors. So for example, you actually saw less negative mental health outcomes with contact interference, which is a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for here? A little bit counterintuitive to our understanding of how parental alienation would impact one's mental health, but perhaps the case here is that because children aren't having to have contact with this parent they're told they're not allowed to like or be around, or they have to, they're told that they have to choose between these two parents. Well, now they're in a situation where they don't even have to be around the other parent. Maybe that is protecting them to some extent from these mental health outcomes during this period of time. But it's hard to know, and again, it's unlikely that in the long run, given the other data we have, that would continue to be the case. So across 2 studies, we found that, again, alienating parents, regardless of gender, I want to point that out for both studies, gender didn't matter. It wasn't more likely to be the case that mothers or fathers had a substantiated claim of abuse when they were an alienating parent. Regardless of gender, the alienating parent was more likely to have a substantiated claim of abuse made against them in family court, and compared to those that were alienated from their children. We also found that parents that were alienated from their children were more likely, there was a greater probability that they would have an unsubstantiated claim of abuse made against them in family court compared to those that were alienating, suggesting again that there's this legal and administrative aggression that's going on. And finally, we found that the total number of PABs tended to most consistently predict negative outcomes when we look at these different categories in children, though there was some nuance to this. So there were some categories that emerged to specifically predict certain other categories of negative outcomes. Limitations. Again, I talk about this in the paper that was originally published, and I think it's obviously still very true for the data that we're looking at now. Parental alienation is extremely complex to define. I don't feel like I need to explain that to anybody in this room. Obviously, we've done a pretty good job at trying to understand it and using empirical methods to better look at how it manifests and the different factors that underlie this construct. However, there's still some disagreement with respect to what this looks like. Though encouragingly, and I cite this work by Dr. Lorendos in the paper as well, family court professionals are getting much better, and there is much more agreement amongst them with respect to what this is, especially when comparing it to what it is definitely not. It's just to note that, if we're looking at this kind of objective data and we're making the assumption that because a family court professional said that parental alienation existed in this case, that it did indeed exist, of course there's a margin of error there, and there are probably some cases where potentially it was not accurately identified. A challenge, again, in studying the relationship between parental alienating behaviors and other forms of abuse is that parental alienating behaviors themselves can also be classified as other forms of abuse. And so I haven't had the opportunity to do this yet with the study 2 data, but with the study 1 data, I did run separate models looking specifically at cases that did not include emotional abuse, because I did note that there was some overlap with emotional abuse claims. Again, it can kind of be viewed as the same thing. The results held, even when we looked at this. And likewise, I looked at cases where there were only claims of intimate partner violence, so no claims of child abuse or emotional abuse. And indeed, our results were still quite similar. They were still significant in those models as well. So it's just important to note that we were very careful in how we analyzed the data and trying to deal with these limitations, but it's still not perfect. Also importantly, with the data we collected for study 2, it's very qualitative. I had research assistants that were looking at it, so we are still looking at some of the reliability there, making sure that everything aligns. I had multiple research assistants coding the data, but there's certainly other things we want to do. Again, we looked at these different categories of parental alienating behaviors. We looked at these different outcomes, broader outcomes in the children. We also looked at some of the manifestations of parental alienating behaviors in children, so how you may see that internalize, things like their cognitive splitting, like signs of splitting. We looked at things like their statements of independence, so saying independent thought, right? So saying that it was their decision to not have a relationship with the other parent. So all of the different 8 manifestations of parental alienation, we did our best to look at as well. We just haven't had an opportunity to analyze all that data. So future directions here are to, again, replicate these findings again with other samples and in different countries, and to understand how these false claims of parental alienation may also be related to other forms of abuse. I do want to note here, I obviously the data shows that, and I believe from all of the other data that exists along with this data, that it seems to be more often the case that alienation and parental alienating behaviors are part of this pattern of coercive, controlling violence and abuse. There were definitely cases that emerged where, and I looked at these closely, I read many of these case studies myself, because I am a field researcher, I'm a social psychologist, and research is me-search, as I said. I like to see what's going on in the real world. I'm very inductive in my approach to creating and developing hypotheses and questions. And when I looked at some of these cases, it was interesting to see that there were times where a parent, at least according to the courts, seemed to be making false allegations of parental alienation. But in these cases, what was interesting to me was that, well, one, they often actually had substantiated claims of abuse against them. And two, if you looked at what they were doing, their behavior, they were engaging in the alienating behaviors. So they were projecting, just as we're arguing the abusive parents are doing here when they make the false claims of abuse, right? They're projecting. Parents making seemingly false claims of parental alienation. I want to stress that this is something that still needs to be looked at more quantitatively with more data. They seem to be projecting that behavior. They're doing it. They're the ones that are trying, and it's this backlash effect that is happening, and then they're claiming parental alienation. So I think that's something that would be interesting to look at, just also to kind of create this better understanding, especially as there is so much polarization across people in this field. I wouldn't say within the field of parental alienation, but of course we know that there's a lot of researchers that are doing all of this work trying to discredit parental alienation, and I think often that work's coming from this perspective of, well, we need to protect victims of abuse, and alienation is just an accusation made by abusive parents. Abusive parents make lots of different accusations, and it can be a false claim of PA, it can be a false claim of abuse. We need to kind of learn to work together to properly and accurately identify real claims of parental alienation and real claims of abuse to protect victims of intimate partner violence and to protect children in these situations. So that's my thought on it. I'll just, leave this final conclusion here. Again, scholars studying PA have argued that PABs are this form of coercively controlling violence. This literature suggests, along with a lot of the other great research that's been done, that that's likely the case. More education should be done into what these behaviors are and how to identify them. And there's been so much great work done already. Just having, in fact, the 5-factor model to identify cases where we would say PA is present versus where it is not. The research adds to this growing body of literature, again, suggesting that parental alienating behaviors are a form of family violence. And by better understanding this process and identifying them early on, we can better protect victims and, importantly, provide appropriate treatment. I mean, listening to the panel here this morning, that was very emotional for me because I've been through the family court system, not personally, but again, with somebody I know, and I've seen how hard it is to treat PA once it becomes severe and how almost impossible it is if you're working with people that don't know what this looks like. And in fact, it ends up leading to more problems in the long run. So that's why I care about the work. I just want to thank my collaborators again, Dr. Harmon, Dr. Lorendos, Dr. Giancarlo, Brian Ludmer, for all of their wonderful work in the field and for letting me use this data. All the RAs that have been involved with all this coding. There was a lot of coding. Thankfully, I didn't have to do too much of it. And all the undergrads that work with me on this. I have so many undergrads that reach out to me about this topic. I will say I started teaching about parental alienation about 4 years ago. I teach it every year when I teach personality. I've never had more students reach out to me about any topic I've ever taught about or talked about researching. And I research some pretty interesting things, I think. I'm into wisdom and stuff like that. But never more people have reached out to me than about this topic, and in a more passionate and emotional way. So it's important work that we're doing, and thank you. And I'm here if you have any questions. I don't know how long I went because I have no sense of time right now, so thank you. you.